Alice Mah is Professor of Urban and Environmental Studies at the University of Glasgow. Prior to this, she was the Principal Investigator of the European Research Council-funded project Toxic Expertise, Environmental Justice and the Global Petrochemical Industry. Her work focuses on toxic pollution and environmental justice. She writes about social and ecological transformations and is always trying to develop anti-colonial ecological futures. Cara Daggett is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Virginia Tech. Her research explores the politics of energy and the environment. One of the things she brings to this conversation is her shrewd sense of the overlap between human well-being, science, technology, and the more than human world. Cara is known for bringing feminist approaches to power to bear on understanding the ways that global heating has emerged and how it can be combated. Her book, The Birth of Energy, has become essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how the acceleration of everything and an ideal of productivity were normalized. These are the underlying logics that inform today's uses of energy. In this conversation, Cara and I ask Alice about her recent book, Petrochemical Planet, Multiscalar Battles of Industrial Transformation. I reached out to Cara to help unpack this book, and she jumped at the chance. Both of us find Petrochemical Planet to be an incomparable study of the petrochemicals industry at a time of planetary collapse. The whole conversation really revolves around how health, environmental protection, and many types of current scientific research are, quote, already places of resistance, where the level of negligence shown by the petrochemicals industry is being exposed and condemned. If we look to these places of resistance, then the idea of degrowth becomes something more complicated and practical than just an academic fad. One of the toughest to crack aspects of this ultra-toxic industry is the fact that it's basically impossible to simply replace petrochemicals in the global economy. There's basically no way to produce them without fossil fuels, and virtually no method of decarbonizing the shadowy production practices that are involved. And the petrochemicals industry is the #1 industrial consumer of fossil fuels globally. Alice and Cara think that the way forward is what they call multiscalar and multi-temporal action. If we're going to save some portion of the Earth we've ravaged, it will mean being able to think and feel and act outside of the very short-term timeframes that we're accustomed to in a system that incentivizes and rewards corporate plunder. Can we imagine forms of multi-temporal resistance and start building things on different timescales? For the Earth to heal from extractivism, we'll have to. This will require a much deeper sense of duration and what Alice describes as an extension of empathy across eons. Just for the sake of setting the scene, as it were, I wanted to quote a part of Petrochemical Planet that does give a kind of lay of the land. Within just a few years, these overlapping and intensifying ecological crises have spiraled to dizzying heights. In 2019, the threat of the climate emergency overtook the plastics and pollution crises in terms of public alarm following the IPCC report on global warming. Reports about the existential planetary threat of the climate crisis surge, with people drawing connections between social and ecological crises. Then, after one of the worst wildfires in modern history in Australia, the so-called Black Summer, came the coronavirus pandemic. And you describe how that's the product of zoonotic spillover and the destruction of wildlife habitats. Coming out of COP28, it's interesting to kind of look at this brief history of the struggle, the climate struggle, and think about what sort of success and failure mean, and what we're sort of up against, right? You say, although there are rising public concerns about the ecological crisis, for the most part, the role of the petrochemical industry in fueling the crisis has evaded scrutiny. You talk about the kind of vertical integration with fossil fuels, obviously, but how it does exist sort of as a satellite of that and operates differently within global capitalist markets. Why, I guess, should, rather than seeing it as separate, we see it as really part of the same struggle for survival, basically.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think it flies under the radar for a number of reasons. Some are actually quite technical that people, if you mention petrochemicals, they actually don't, generally speaking, know what they are. And actually, when I was starting out with the project, I knew they were kind of toxic and saw them as pollution, but I didn't actually know that 80% of what they produce is plastic. I
Mhm.
knew that it was one of the things, but I didn't know that they're in 95% of all manufactured goods. So the idea that they are virtually in almost everything, and it's not necessarily purely in plastic form, but it's often in a composite form. So just the absolute extent of their entanglement with it in our everyday. I think a lot of people also don't realize that you can't easily substitute the material input, so that 99% of petrochemicals come from fossil fuels, and it is actually quite difficult to manufacture them out of anything else. There are small inputs in terms of biomass, like sugar, but that's also causing land problems and is very, very difficult to scale.
Mhm.
So they're very much a major contributor in their own right as well to the climate crisis, being the number one industrial consumer of fossil fuels and the third largest industrial emitter. So it's the fact that even scientists and technology experts they say that it's almost impossible to decarbonize an industry that's so dependent on fossil fuels. And I think the other two things that are really a problem when it comes to this industry, which is inherently toxic, causes many health problems from a climate perspective, is that the industry positions itself as part of the solution. So they're in a lot of the green technologies, in lightweight fuels, and they aren't going to give up the game anytime soon.
Well, I just want to start by thanking you for writing this book because I felt like especially in the last couple years, I felt like, wow, we really need a book about petrochemicals. And I wasn't aware of this long running, amazingly rich empirical research that you've done. And I'm just grateful that this book exists. It's so important. So as soon as Scott asked me to come talk about it, even just hearing the title, I thought, yes, I really want to come talk about petrochemicals because, I mean, so far my work has been in what is called energy studies, but I think in some ways now I feel like the problem is that energy is what everyone wants to talk about, which you mentioned this in the book. Energy kind of dominates with the things people want to fund and do about the climate crisis. And I think because it lends itself to kind of a green growth technical solution in terms of substituting with solar or wind. And this perceived, different crises that are in tension with each other. I feel like is really important to highlight, and especially this idea that I think what you said, like there is no solution. There's not a technological solution. There's not really a way to decarbonize it, and that is really part of why people don't want to talk about it and why we should talk about it. Um, and I think this is where oil companies have pinned their hopes. Like, okay, well, if we're gonna do solar and wind, I mean, I still don't think they've given up on fossil fuel as motive power, but they're also just really glad that there is this thing called petrochemicals that, no one really has an idea how to solve. And like you said, it really brings up that the solution has to be more than technological. The solution is cultural. The solution is systems change. There's no other way to really start to talk about petrochemicals.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, I guess, recall that the petrochemical industry did not emerge in its own right. It emerged as a way of finding byproducts from oil.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for most of its early history, that was it was seen as recycling waste, which actually the industry likes to say that they were very early movers in the circular economy. But yeah, with the exponential growth of plastics after the Second World War, which I thought was quite interesting that it wasn't by accident. It was actively promoted, the growth of all these kinds of products and pushing them onto consumers in that period. But among those that are chemicals that are produced, I mean, ethylene goes into polyethylene, and that's one of the
Right.
most widely circulated in consumer plastics.
Mm-hmm.
Of their biggest market for plastics is single-use plastics, and a lot of that is in packaging, which is made out of polyethylene. I mean, also a number of the other byproducts are even more toxic, like the whole aromatic side, like the benzenes are the most famous, which are in things like polystyrene, which have caused a lot more trouble for the industry because of all these sort of toxic scandals around causing cancer and leaching out and all these sorts of fears. But I think one of the dynamics that is quite tricky with the industry is that it is not as though you can just produce ethylene or you can just produce one of the different components or just refine them. They all kind of come as a package. And so it's what the chemists refer to as the 2-for-1 principle. So in a way, even if you were to sort of say, okay, well, let's limit the toxicity of particular kinds of chemicals by only producing this one, then you're left with all this other toxic byproduct that you don't know what to do with, which does have, industrial uses, which many of which cause health problems.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question,
No,
but it
great.
is.
Like,
I mean,
I
I'm
think
not a chemist, I must say.
exactly. It's like hard to see for people that don't have this particular training, I guess, right? Which I don't. But so what we tend to encounter in community is the kind of downstream effects, right? And those are the triggering events. Those are the things that represent social tipping points, at least for time, that you're, I think, hoping can somehow scale up. Like that's the sort of vision. It's like you quote Anna Singh as saying that like paying attention to specific local ecologies does not scale up. This is a system where most of it's invisible. Most of these petrochemicals are traveling on these bomb trains constantly, right? But when they go off, there's something that is like a literal rupture that seems to represent a kind of psychological rupture and some kind of political possibility. You talk about the first national protest by Black activists over toxic injustice in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, and Love Canal in 1978. But also you talk about the Bhopal gas tragedy. So many, right? These disasters are very context specific. And they're about the people in these communities expressing anger and defending their lives. Can you speak to, I guess, how those moments show the potential for rupture?
So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If I can go, if you permit me to go back to this claim that you made that I like to resist the dread and the doom, the terrifying aspects. I think that I was always and still am swinging back and forth between that and a very, very thin line of of thinking about the resistance in a way, and I think that those triggering events, certainly, if you want to call them that, I mean, you could talk about them on different scales, on the global scale as well as movements or ruptures, uh, terrible things happening in communities. I think those definitely provide sparks to the flame of anger and the horrors of the injustices that people face, the really, awful harms, and rising up against them, and very much led by, communities of color in North America, and resistance movements worldwide, all with very different kinds of dynamics. But I don't know that I would. I mean, I think the fundamental tension is about the scaling up, because I think taking Sing's point about the fact that you can't scale that up, that isn't to say that we necessarily should scale them,
Right.
in the sense that if you do in the same way, then that risks losing diversity and risks unintended consequences. So yeah, I think the power of fighting, the power of resisting, it's important, but it's difficult not to be actually quite pessimistic if you see that happening, and if you look at the details and the surges of activism that have, gone worldwide and in many communities, and the number of victories compared with the number of, I guess you could say, calamities, failures, rollbacks, pushbacks, co-optations. It does. It's an uphill battle. Effectively, that's what I'm talking about. And the whole motivation to write this is to look a little more closely at the levers that are possible. But I would say it's only a tiny start, and I don't know that an academic book is really where it's at. I think it's in the world, and we don't have control over that. But it's laying it out. I would say it is still quite sobering.
I think there's tons of value in the book. Like this is something that I know, Cara, you've kind of come back to, is like academics will, in some ways for good reason, like worry about the political impact of their work, and knowledge mobilization being like an uphill battle. But nobody else, to my mind, has done the work of this book. So there is like inherent value in just like having that as a foundation. And part of the foundation is like trying to convey what's in the title, which is this idea of like a multi-scalar approach, which doesn't just refer to the local and the global, but also like timescales. And I kind of wanted to pick up on that to some extent, like this idea of planetary deep time. It's a planetary crisis that comes to this kind of inflection point in the contemporary moment, that forces us to try and zoom out. So I guess I wanted to kind of connect these two ideas of entanglement, essentialness, and like ephemerality too, because COVID-19 gave people an opportunity to think about work, post-work, anti-work, having to withdraw from life in order to preserve life. So I wonder if we can like think about COVID, so-called post-COVID, in this moment as something that does feel like it was only experienced in kind of an ephemeral way. Like for the most part, it feels like society has moved on.
Well, I might jump in because I too really appreciated the multi-scalar theorization of this book, which was pointing to how the kind of very local politics of resistance, you're covering it both as crucial and ongoing, and in some cases there have been some successes, but over and over in the book we see what seems like in the moment sometimes failure. And it made me think a little bit along with what you said, Scott, that there needs to be also a multi-temporal resistance. And I think this is you have this notion of the mole, where you're talking about the way organizing works and resistance works, and the importance of the mole going underground, digging all these tunnels, making all these preparations, And you might only see the moment when the movement pops up in this kind of moment of specific temporal crisis, but that structure that's been built over time is important. And I think this relates to COVID and it relates to the way we talk about the climate crisis. There's so much pressure from how governments approach it and sort of mainstream, more neoliberal approaches for kind of like an urgency approach, utilitarian, like every plan you do, you have to have metrics showing like right away it works according to X, Y, and Z. I think that really works against a kind of multi-temporal approach to change, where you might be building things on different timescales. And like you quote Kyle Powys White a lot, and I also am really inspired by this idea that some of the things that have to be repaired take a really long time. It's not something you can kind of build a new technology and next year have metrics that you've repaired a relationship. So I wondered what you thought about how time plays in here. And I think COVID's a good example, Scott, because it's like there's such a kind of crisis urgent mode of thinking and acting that's really like to me almost purposefully works against this kind of mole-like slower time scale that some resistance requires.
I mean, in terms of where I would like to bring research in the future, it is very much on that. I like that word, the multi-temporal, the deep time. I don't actually think that, well, certainly, I guess, academics and mainstream sort of societies, as I am aware of them, are very good at thinking about deep time. Like, even if you think about the climate crisis kind of rhetoric around not even just urgency, but around like these kind of times, like 2050, even 2100, that is really actually not very long. And it's very difficult to conceptualize. You sort of think, well, maybe it's more tangible if you think about your children or maybe grandchildren, but beyond that, they're like kind of speculative humans. And so it's that extension of empathy along a deeper amount of time, it is quite difficult. And the lessons as well. I mean, if we can't even remember about the lessons of COVID now, and go back to, business as usual with flying and with, hygiene and all kinds of other policies, then how are we supposed to remember all these, these very long histories of struggle, of injustice, of things that of basically other forms of knowledge and ways of being in the world.
Yeah, an extension of empathy across multiple timescales is really incredible. Like, it's something that I've heard Angela Davis talk about. So it really speaks to this insidious logic of like co-optation that you're writing about in the book. Whereby notions of like net zero, especially setting targets of 2050 and endlessly deferring action, like really serves the purpose of, profitability. So I guess, to frame it as a question, what is particularly toxic about this sort of this kind of corporate behavior that sees opportunity in climate change,
I think what is particularly, I guess, alarming or problematic about this particular industry is, well, they didn't start doing this just now. For one thing, they've been doing it for a very long time. The sort of denial of the problems that they generate, and I think precisely actually what you said, this idea that they seek profitability and they don't look after people or animals or nature. I mean, that's kind of, I guess, what you would expect. What is more insidious is how they basically play different crises and problems off of each other. But they're actually using that as a bit of a smokescreen to not talk about what they've been denying for years and years, and they're never going to admit unless they get held up in court, which is about poisoning people through toxic pollution, through knowing very well that what they're producing is toxic to human health within, thousands of consumer products that are in people's households, in what are known as fence line communities, where those manufacturing of the chemicals is quite close to many poor and more marginalized and ethnic minority communities. So they know full well about that, and they're quite happy to reposition basically the game or their what they do to their advantage, so that they kind of come out well on some accounts, but then can continue making profit in things that they actually know are harmful. And I think the level of negligence of actually being completely aware of doing something that is killing people and killing ecosystems and is also unnecessary because it's in a lot of rubbish, like things that we don't need. That is what I think is particularly problematic.
Yeah, I found myself, some of my favorite parts of the book were your descriptions of field work in these corporate rooms. I don't know why I'm so fascinated by how powerful people are, like, what is the cognitive dissonance going on? But I am, because I think it's happening in these spaces of power, but it also somehow it resonates more broadly to the extent that all of us are complicit, and many of us participate in some kind of cognitive dissonance just to get through the day. Sure. I guess that's my fascination. So I really loved this insight that I got from the book, which is like, and this is to Scott's question, why is capitalism excited about climate crisis now, especially energy? You talk about how when you go to these meetings, there's so much talk about climate change, and this could be an existential crisis. And I mean, they're very willing to talk about certain problems and critiques. And those are the ones, I think, where they see some kind of strategy to be the solution, like you said, and do it profitably, or use the same playbook to get through it. And what speaks volumes, right, is where the silence is. And that really struck me when you said that they never talked about health. They never talked that, like, no one would ever talk about, this is a big existential crisis for our industry too. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe it raises a whole, just for all the industries involved now, because there are many in responding to the climate crisis. It's like, where are the silences? Because those are the things, I think, those are the places where there is not an answer yet that is friendly to that industry. And perhaps those are places, I mean, I don't know. I want to go to do the move of saying, well, those are the places for resistance and whatever, but those already are the places of resistance. That's what your book outlines. So it's just hard. And I can see you in the book toggling back and forth between appreciation and despair, and of these kinds of histories of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to Ingrid Waldron recently, right? The author of There's Something in the Water. And the last question I asked her was about water. Like, why water? And I think, water is coterminous with with like survival, with collective, like, well-being and public health. So there is, I think, a lot of potential in pointing out those moments of like silencing. You talk about on page 21 of the book, you say complexity was hardly an insight. Complexity often prevents insight. But you're saying that, like, actually my target is the resilience of the system and these kind of autopoetic properties of complex systems. But yeah, I agree, Carol. Like those moments where you're like in a conference and you talk about like the comic effect of seeing like the petrochemical industries players in these like really rehearsed ways talking about their concern. Like the reader feels your animosity. I do anyway. And I guess I'll ask, like, who did you imagine your intended readers to be? Did you think about that at all in terms of like, because I know Waldron, like, she's writing certainly from the perspective of these like community groups that she, and also interdisciplinary partnerships that she's kind of like forged. Um,
I mean, I actually never intended to write a monograph out of the Toxic Expertise Project because I thought it was too, complicated, and it was collaborative. We each did different parts and did case study based research, and yeah, that kind of question around the complexity is like, how do you tell a story about so many different sites? And from the beginning of the project, also, because we were gaining access to different corporate spaces, I was trying very hard to not let bias lead into it, to think, oh, well, maybe, there are, this idea that can be nice people working within industry, of course, there are. And so maybe you could maybe appeal to anybody reading this book, including an industry actor. That was sort of where I began.
right.
But I think during the early part of the pandemic, as I continued doing research beyond the span of that project, like following the conferences, following the debates, seeing the Black Lives Matter protests, it was almost like I kind of like, you could say, an anger overtook me, because there, and reading about the implication with the Nazi period with the IG Farben, that I started to really feel like actually these are very much incommensurable. There is no way that the industry actors are why should one fall into the same way of speaking and go to their level in a way to try to make the case when the case has been made for so long and there's so many lies, there's so much outright deception. I mean, I have been invited to industry conferences to speak to them about plastics, for example, and I have. And it's interesting how you kind of get you're the person who's then being asked to go up and waive their grievances for them, and you know what I mean, like, and say, yes, look, we're taking this on board. Look, it's a woman who's talking about us. We're dealing with it. Or getting questions like, oh, well, could you just tell us why it is that the people in South Asia aren't educated well enough to deal with their litter problem? Because it's just a totally different way of looking at things. So it's sort of, yeah, you do need to meet people where they are in a way, and not everybody's in the same place on the journey. And that's what I do hope to convey in the book. So some people might take something from it, but others might think, oh no, that's going a little too far, or it doesn't really resonate. That's fine. So I would hope that, yeah, and anybody could pick up the book. It's meant to be written in a very accessible way. And I deliberately try not to be too academic in terms of the kinds of terms or theories that are used. It's much more about the resonance of resistance, about common tools, interventions, and just showing a bit more about the complexities and the sneakiness, and showing that kind of the layers of what we're up against effectively. If you take them all together, this is what we're up against, and it's pretty, yeah, terrifying, but you need to start somewhere. And there's obviously a long tradition of that resistance that shouldn't be forgotten and needs to be, encouraged and helped, despite the fact that there are so many setbacks.
what I really found helpful in the book about resistance was that you were going back and forth between labor resistance and then ideas about just transition, which come out of labor movements, and which sometimes are not very critical of growth and sometimes even become kind of sometimes can serve industrial interests, as you point out. And then fence line communities who are resisting on the basis of their health, their well-being, toxicity. And then you have a section about degrowth. And I think it's bringing these different communities together. There's a lot of sympathy there that you show, that you bring for all of these different groups, which don't agree and don't always work together very well, especially just transition and degrowth, and the writing that you do about why it's so hard to mount labor resistance against petrochemicals, especially these like drive-in, drive-out communities. You know, that I see that too with with fracking communities, for example. They sometimes they're called man camps, is just the workers literally fly in and fly out, and they're not, there's an effort on the part of the communities to bring families there, but yeah, so I think if the book speaks to different people, that's where I feel like there's a lot of value, is ideas about how, and maybe where you have more of a hope, I don't know if it's a hopeful, but where there's more of a idea about possibility, is that there are these movements, especially just transition and degrowth, and increasingly workers are, I think this is a question for you, I think you feel like you're noticing workers being more open to degrowth ideas as you are talking to them in this project.
This is the way, to some extent, that you're both theorizing degrowth as a coordinated movement, not as a simplistic thing by any means. And I think like that's my, the thing I find so impactful about the way that you encounter the degrowth argument, Alice, is that you're saying like too often there is this reduction of degrowth to like a vision of, you say, post-capitalist islands that eventually might affect the larger politics, that you can have degrowth movements existing on the periphery of capitalism, and that creates some kind of lasting change.
With degrowth in particular, I mean, I am quite cautious about the use of the term, in the sense that, it has, there are degrowthers, or a degrowth move. There's a long and, varied history, I suppose, of degrowth, where people identify within the degrowth community. It's very, I mean, it's actually very much led by, you could say, people in the global north or Western scholars. And it's been criticized on many counts for failing to recognize problems in impoverished communities effectively, and for being a campaign on something negative like D um, instead of something positive. And for, I mean, I would say that my main ambivalence with it is that it doesn't actually have a theory of change, which is what I think it, or a pathway there. And I think just transitions is a start towards that, but they kind of are at opposite points, where one is very much in the moment, thinking about job losses, thinking about livelihoods, and how you secure, a better future. But it's so bogged down in the everyday that it's not quite yet maybe ready to, often on the ground, to think about, well, what would an ideal future, or what would an ideal present be? How could we create those conditions? But yeah, in terms of, I think in that way, that's partly why in the book I'm a little bit reluctant to necessarily name things always. So I think, you could call it degrowth, you could call it post growth, or just rejecting the mantra of economic growth led by GDP for growth's sake. And I think all of those have synergies. And there's also resonance with, communities in Latin America who use different terminology that's actually quite similar around commoning and around indigenous autonomous movements. I think it's basically the truth that we all know. That's what I feel like. In like, if you just think about those charts about, just to take petrochemicals, exponentially rising petrochemical use, where, back in the 70s there were no plastic bottles. Now there are half a trillion bottles every year. The fact that there's, these, it is just projected to rise. There's no sense in which it's scaling back. This is the same if you look at other industries like concrete and all the waste elements of the green technologies as well. Like, think about all the graveyards of the electric cars and so on, population. So it just seems obvious that we cannot indefinitely continue to grow. and that, like what Cara said sort of in the beginning about the sort of reproducing the extractive models. So just thinking, okay, well, we'll switch out oil and gas. We'll use, dodgy things as transition fuels for as long as possible. We'll hedge them by making petrochemicals out of all the oil and gas anyway. And then we'll just switch on to other very land extractive renewable technologies and sectors. And everybody will have the same amount of energy as before, the same amount of stuff as before, actually more stuff. And at some point, yeah, we will reach. All this. It's scientists who are, planetary scientists or Earth scientists who are saying we've already passed all these planetary boundaries. We've passed the tipping point already. And so, yeah, I guess the deeper question, or one of the deeper questions, is really like, what does it take for in terms of those tipping points for people to really change their ways of thinking and being? And my fear is that it will not be until something like COVID, where it's so far upon us, that it will effectively be not just too late for the cultural side, but just generally too late, except for those who are, able to go off in their rafts and so on. So that's why I think, yeah, it is encouraging to see, though, that it's no longer a peripheral idea questioning this idea of growth for growth's sake. It is in many, mainstream international organizations and bodies who are saying, yeah, we shouldn't just use GDP. We need to look at this further. But it just keeps getting overturned effectively. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to see if enough people come to that realization, which I think they probably know on some level, and are able to, or have the capacity, because I think that's an important thing, to sort of act to rein it in or to change things.
Yeah, and I know, like, Cara, the thing that your work is so influential on is like showing how energy doesn't just serve material needs; it serves like identity needs, right? That there are gendered ways in which we're attached to energy, and so like, or I mean, if you think about plastic containers, single-use plastics, there's like a kind of attachment to convenience that people find difficult to divorce themselves from. So I think like both of you are saying that needs to be questioned. There needs to be a destabilizing of that. And so, yeah, both of you are kind of thinking through alternative ways of living and thinking. Cara, you talk about like new experiments, right? In ways of living, pleasure. You talk about the role of pleasure.
I think I came to degrowth with a lot of the similar feelings of hesitation that Alice just outlined. And I do think, like any field, it's had its limits and blind spots. I think feminists have taken it to task for not citing a lot of feminist work and not citing indigenous work, global South movements. But to be honest, my sense of the field is that it's really expanded and taken a lot of these critiques on board and been very open. And so I find a lot of the most exciting work there's a lot of exciting work happening in that space. And it's probably a little bit like we're talking about with resistance movements. There's a need to realize there's not one single magical answer. There's a need to recognize each of these movements. Like degrowth is very much a global north white academic thing. And that's okay. I think if we recognize it's a certain community and then we think, how do we appreciate difference, and also how do we work together and make solidarity and be humble about what we know, and so on and so forth, I think it's okay. And but the bigger question, what I really appreciate about degrowth, not the name itself, which I agree is like about giving things up or limiting or anti, is that I do think the actual literature of it has a politics about living well, even though it's not in the name. And when I think about theories of change, there's actually been this great book called Degrowth and Strategy. It's an edited book where they say, yeah, we haven't been good about thinking about theories of change, and they make an effort to do that. So I recommend that as one recent attempt to do that. But when I think about theories of change and, what does it take to make people realize, I feel like almost that's just that sort of rational, as much as I'm a teacher and I love seeing how information and knowledge can change the way you see the world. I also think we have to appreciate these kinds of attachments that are not about learning new information or seeing a crisis and then going, oh, now I get it. Now I should, change. And this kind of cultural change or identity change, I think is something that is going to be more in line with what Alice is talking about with complex systems change, multi-temporal, multi-scalar, and really appreciating, not just saying, well, gee, it's so bad that our identities are attached to plastic and oil, but saying like, what does that serve? Like, what is behind that need and desire? Which maybe is where Alice is going with thinking about what is essential. And, what is it compensating for is an interesting question for me about consumerism. Like, and if it's compensating for something, how do we start to design or imagine other kinds of attachments and pleasures? And to me, that is maybe a better strategy for bringing people together than the sort of guilt-based or sacrifice or ascetic-based, which it's not that those things aren't true. I think that we should feel guilty and we do need to give things up, and all those things are true too. So I don't know. It's complicated, right?
Yeah, I've been talking to my students a lot about plastics. I was teaching this material last week in health communication and in communication theory. And there is like a real desire to imagine a kind of like the end of the plastics era, but they kind of can't, they can't, they can't really imagine what could replace this ubiquitous material. And it's not their fault. Like it's okay that they can't imagine it. And I think like this again, in terms of Alice, your approach to understanding degrowth it's so valuable. Like trying to see the whole multi-scalar interlocking spheres of activity within capitalism is like the thing that you're both kind of prompting people to do, and giving them the language, I think, to do it as well. Any do either of you? I feel like I've monopolized hosting duties. Are there things that I didn't speak to that you think we should maybe address?
So one thing we didn't talk about that I loved in the book was the military history of petrochemicals, which you really emphasize, and the way actually the industry is set up along military lines in some sense. Like the industry itself is militarized. And then in other places, when you talk about resistance, you sort of wonder in one place you sort of wonder, like, it's difficult to imagine that this gets undone peacefully.
Mm.
And these are kind of questions I sit with myself. I just wanted to hear you speak more about that, about both of those things, like how militarized the industry is and what that means for resisting it.
When I spoke earlier about what kind of made me a little bit angry about finding out about some aspects of the industry, was actually that I was quite surprised in a way to see how much the industry positions itself in an adversarial way internally, and uses very explicit kinds of militaristic language, like that they're at war with regulators, with environmentalists, that they've got a knife edge to their throat, and the ways in which the whole industry is shaped by, conquest over land, access to supply chains, and very, violent, monopolistic behaviors. It would be probably a whole too long really to describe in a nutshell why that is, how I observe that to be the case. But I think one thing that was interesting was how actually, even when I was speaking to some of the consultants, they compared the petrochemical wing of the oil and gas industry, as being less transparent, more monopolistic, and basically more secretive than the oil industry itself, citing secrecy documents. And I think the fact that it was founded on cartels that grew out of especially Germany during the interwar period, who prevented other players from joining, dominated the expertise, dominated the supply chains, the cheap resources that they depended on, dominated the knowledge, and built these huge facilities that also rely on kind of dominating the modes, because you could never enter such a market unless you had all those elements of the knowledge. And so I think that's quite important to think about, because they've retained their hold over infrastructure, over technological expertise, and over those systems. So when you say, okay, well, we need to do something about changing even one plastic, then you need to go through their whole set of scientists, catalytic converter people, like the whole system of the technological aspects of it, that nobody else really understands. So they hold those keys, and they fight to keep it a closed shop where they won't reveal the names of certain chemicals or even what they're doing beyond the bare minimum of regulation. So to resist an industry that has such a long track record of market control, effectively, where they will resort effectively to collusion and violence if they're under threat, is important to know. They're much more aware, like you said, of what the opposition is in their terms. So they've done the surveying of the scene within the industry. They know where all the weak spots are in the regulations. They know where all the all the threats are effectively, and they see it in a quite almost dispassionate way, where they kind of go in and iron out the problems that they see without a particular, at a high level, regard for the consequences. And so to understand that level of, I guess, ruthlessness means that you're playing with it. When you enter into conflict with that kind of a player, then you need to understand what you're up against. I think the trap, though, is to be drawn into the same terms of battle means accepting the terms of the game. And so I think that's ultimately a big part of the problem. If what you need to change is the entire system, all those underlying aspects of how difficult it is to detoxify it, to decarbonize it, to degrow it, to ensure better ways of living on the planet, or that sort of thing, then really the mechanisms for doing so are not going to be very easy. I don't think they'll give it up very easily.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for a whole other hour, I think, about what you just said. The idea of not reproducing that system by, being drawn in, to use your term, to the kind of language of conquest. How to change the world without sort of trying to take over. It's really impossibly difficult to imagine another way, though. As you said at one point in the book, it feels as though change is only possible through war, or I think you say legislation, basically, right? Through law or war. But it's this kind of attempt to break the power of what you at a certain point call patriarchal capitalism, corporate plunder. I think in this context, what I appreciate is that both of you are far more interested in trying to really dwell with entanglement, interdependency, these relationships that what Anna Singh calls these Holocene attachments, where we still have something going, where the life-preserving systems of nature are still operating, right? Those are where you see forms of resistance. And the anger comes from seeing forces plundering those exact and fracturing those relationships, I think. So I don't know, I really appreciate that particular articulation of politics that says we need to angrily extend empathy and preserve these relationships. Yeah, so I appreciate you both making the time to talk about this incredible book and to try and draw some of these connections.
Well, I'll just say thank you for writing the book, Alice, and I really recommend everyone to read it. I will look forward to teaching it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you, Alice. Nice to see you again, Scott.